One of the great ironies of Western civilization is that many philosophical movements have claimed Socrates as their intellectual ancestor, yet the ancient Greek philosopher said he had no doctrines to teach. What's more, Socrates' influence on Western culture is hardly limited to philosophy. He has come to symbolize the relentless pursuit of truth, regardless of the consequences. Socrates has become an ideal of intellectual honesty for all disciplines. Socrates apparently wrote nothing of any consequence. If he did, it has not survived, so what we know of him must be drawn from the testimony of others who knew him or knew of him. And while that testimony is considerable, it hardly provides a coherent picture of the man and his philosophy. It's difficult to decide which, if any, of these very different portraits is the best likeness of the real Socrates. This is known as the Socratic problem, and it continues to divide scholars even today. In antiquity, there was no shortage of Socraticoi logoi, or writings about Socrates. But most of these writings have been lost over the centuries, and much of what has survived cannot be entirely trusted. Plutarch, the Greek biographer of the 1st century AD, wrote his account of Socrates some 5 centuries after Socrates was alive. Diogenes Laertius, a biographer in the 3rd century AD, wrote 7 centuries after Socrates had lived. Fortunately, several substantial works have survived from 3 of Socrates' contemporaries: the comic poet Aristophanes, the historian Xenophon, and the philosopher Plato. Each of these authors probably knew Socrates well, and their testimonies offer us a fuller account of the historical Socrates and his philosophy. The least helpful of the 3 contemporary writers is Aristophanes. Although Socrates is mentioned in several of his plays, Aristophanes actually gives a central character the name Socrates in the play entitled Clouds. According to Plato, Socrates himself told the jury at his trial that Aristophanes' portrayal of him as an atheistic sophist had created a great deal of the prejudice against him in Athens. There is no question but that the Socrates character in Clouds tries to undermine the established values of Athenian society. Aristophanes has Socrates tell a potential student,
"There is no God at all except the ones we believe in: chaos, the clouds, and tongue. These alone are our gods. The others, Zeus and the rest, are nonsense. There is no Olympian Zeus."
Many Athenians were convinced after seeing the play that the real Socrates was an atheist and a sophist. Socrates became known for his supposedly devious reasoning. Commentators now generally agree that Aristophanes intended the character Socrates to be a composite of the so-called new intellectuals. This was a mixed group of thinkers, sophists, and proto-scientists who questioned the orthodox thinking of the day. Aristophanes probably chose Socrates as a symbol for the group because his philosophizing openly challenged the received moral opinions of that time. Moreover, Socrates' disheveled appearance and his many eccentricities made him an instantly recognizable figure, and a comic one at that. The Socrates character in Clouds is really a pastiche, a character that espouses a mixture of attitudes and positions, each exaggerated for comic effect. Nevertheless, it's likely that comments by the character Socrates in Clouds are actually similar to comments by the historical Socrates. Which views belong to the historical Socrates, however, we cannot say with certainty. Xenophon wrote extensively about Socrates, but his writing did little to settle the Socratic problem. He wrote a multi-part reminiscence of Socrates entitled The Memorabilia, along with a dialogue about Socrates' views entitled Symposium. Both are clearly intended to put the philosopher in the best light possible. This Socrates is so filled with conventional platitudes and pious homilies that it becomes difficult to see why the Athenians could ever view the man as a threat to anything. Here is one of Xenophon's characteristically bland descriptions.
Socrates neither said nor did anything impious regarding the gods. And what he said and did regarding the gods were what one says and does who is and is thought to be most pious. He was of all men the most in control of his passions and appetites. He was the most determined in the face of cold and heat and all adversity. And having been taught to need only what is moderate, when he procured very little, he was altogether content. Being this sort of person, how could he have made others impious, lawbreakers, greedy, licentious, or weak?
According to Xenophon, Socrates threatens no one, and his philosophical acumen is so slight that it's difficult to see how Socrates attracted bright young men as we know he did. As we turn to Plato's picture of Socrates, we should be cautious about which Platonic works are counted as evidence. Today, most scholars agree that some of the works bearing Plato's name are not genuine. Of the 27 or so works produced by the hand of Plato, most feature a character named Socrates, who usually leads the discussion. There are good reasons to think that not all of these characters could represent the views of the historical Socrates. So which, if any, of the Platonic dialogues develop the views of the genuine Socrates? We can begin to answer this question by dividing Plato's dialogues into 3 groups. These correspond to an early, a middle, and a late period in Plato's career. The Socrates appearing in the dialogues of the latter 2 periods expresses a wide range of technical philosophical interests. By contrast, the Socrates of the early period is concerned with moral issues, and he constructs his arguments exclusively from the responses of others who participated in his discussions. Most commentators now agree that Socrates, as depicted in Plato's middle and late periods, was a mouthpiece for Plato. In other words, the middle and late Socrates discusses views that Plato himself accepted at the time. It may seem, then, that the Socrates of Plato's earlier dialogues must therefore represent the views of the real Socrates, but this is not necessarily true either. The Socratic problem probably cannot be solved decisively, but we should keep in mind that Socrates, as depicted in the early Platonic dialogues, seriously challenges the moral orthodoxy of 5th century Athens. So it's not hard to understand why defenders of the moral status quo, such as the prominent politician Anytus as well as Meletus, who prosecuted Socrates, would have wanted to silence him. Consider, for example, that in Plato's dialogue entitled Meno, Socrates suggests that some leading Athenian citizens had failed to improve their children. Socrates begins with a series of rhetorical questions about a citizen named Themistocles. This is the same famous general and statesman who was instrumental in forging the successful Athenian strategy in the Greek war against the Persians.
Do you say that Themistocles was a good man? And if any man was a good teacher of his virtue, this man was. But do you think he would have wished others to become noble and good, most of all his son? Or do you think that he envied his own son and purposefully denied him the virtue which was his own? Did you ever hear from anyone, young or old, that Cleophantus, the son of Themistocles, was as good and wise a man as his father?
After running through a series of such questions, Socrates concludes that virtue must not be teachable. In the process, Socrates offended by name some of the most important people in the city. Plato's early dialogues enable us to see why bright, young, philosophically minded men in Athens would have been attracted to Socrates. The Socrates depicted here is interested in far more than merely asking questions and revealing the ignorance of others. He is a serious philosopher whose intriguing positive views provide a complex moral theory. It's not surprising that this philosopher would have had a significant following of people who later developed their own sophisticated views. Finally, in addressing the Socratic problem, we must consider the testimony of Aristotle. Socrates and Aristotle were not contemporaries, but Aristotle studied and taught in Plato's school, the Academy, for 20 years. Aristotle was in an excellent position to know what the actual Socrates thought, and he often refers to Socrates' views in his writings. There's reason then to think that Aristotle's report of Socrates is accurate. And since Aristotle's Socrates fits very nicely with the Socrates of Plato's early period, we can reasonably suppose that Plato's early dialogues also say something significant about the historical Socrates. Therefore, when we refer to Socrates, we will have Plato's early testimony in mind. Now that we've established what we don't know about Socrates, it's time to discuss what we do know. Socrates was born in 469 BC in the Greek city-state of Athens. He lived his entire life there, and his family lived modestly. Diogenes Laertius, writing many centuries after the death of Socrates, tells us,
Socrates was the son of Sophroniscus, a stoneworker, and of Finarity, a midwife.
In all likelihood, Socrates learned his father's trade, but there is no credible evidence that he practiced it. Little is known about Socrates' youth, but it is important to note that he was born as Athens was entering the most exhilarating phase of her history. The mid-5th century BC was the beginning of a golden age in Athenian culture. Drama, sculpture, and architecture flourished, and the artifacts that have survived are monuments to the creative brilliance of the period. In political life, democratic rule came into its own. The key assumption of this democratic order was that every male born within the boundaries of Athens could, when he reached manhood, vote, hold office, and serve on juries. This was also a time of intellectual revolution. Travelling teachers, known as sophists, challenged commonly held notions about religion, science, and ethics. For example, there was Thrasymachus, a 5th century BC teacher of rhetoric, who ridiculed the value of behaving justly.
The just man everywhere comes out worse than the unjust man. First, in their dealings with each other, where the one enters into a partnership with the other, nowhere will you discover that the just man comes out with more than the unjust man, but less. And then, in those matters pertaining to the city, whenever there are taxes, the just man pays more than what is equal, and the unjust less. Or when there is a distribution of good, the just man gains nothing, but the unjust man gets much of it. And when each holds office, it belongs to the just man, if he suffers no other penalty, to have his own affairs suffer, and to benefit nothing from the state because of his justice, and to displease his relatives and acquaintances, when he would not be willing to serve them on account of his injustice.
Words like these apparently persuaded many Athenians to use their formidable military to attract allies who could help pay for expensive civic projects. After the Persian Wars, Athens formed an alliance with dozens of independent Greek islands, all of whom agreed to cooperate in defending Greece against future Persian attacks. The Athenian assembly then offered its allies the unattractive alternatives of paying taxes or being annihilated, and this is how Athenian civic projects were funded. As Socrates grew to manhood, Athens, the mother of democracy, turned into a rapacious tyrant. As the Athenian lust for power grew, the city clashed with Sparta, the other major power among the Greek city-states. The Peloponnesian War erupted in 431 BC, when Socrates was 39 years old. According to Plato, Socrates served in the ranks of the heavily armoured Athenian soldiers. In this he was no different from thousands of other Athenians, but his valour on the battlefield was anything but ordinary. An Athenian general named Laches, who is quoted in one of Plato's dialogues, says that Socrates exemplified honour and courage.
I watched Socrates elsewhere doing the right thing by his country. He accompanied me during the retreat from Delium, and I tell you that if the others had wished to be like him, the honor of our city would have been upheld, and we would not have endured such a disaster.
In another Platonic dialogue entitled The Symposium, a brilliant politician and general named Alcibiades declares that Socrates had an incredible capacity to endure the rigours of military life.
First, with regard to the hardships, he was superior not only to me, but to all the others as well. When we had been cut off somewhere and we were unable to get food, as happens on campaigns, the others couldn't compare to his endurance. Moreover, when he feasted, he was singularly able to enjoy, and though not wanting to drink, when he was forced, he outdid us all. Yet, what is most amazing of all, no one has ever witnessed Socrates drunk. But among the other things he did, I marveled at his endurance in winter. Once there was a really terrible frost, and either we did not go out, or if anyone did, we wrapped up incredibly well, putting on our shoes and wrapping our feet in woven wool and sheepskin. But Socrates went out in these conditions, wearing the same cloak he was accustomed to wearing. Going barefooted, he walked more easily over the ice than did the others who were wearing shoes.
All ancient commentators agree that Socrates had absolute control over his emotions and desires. This is not to say that he was an ascetic, that is, one who tries to avoid physical pleasure altogether. When Socrates could enjoy himself, he did, but when conditions called for him to endure hardship, he did that too, and with no complaint. Socrates was not a handsome man, far from it. By all accounts, his bulging eyes, snub nose, and round belly made him singularly unattractive. More than one ancient source compared his appearance to that of a satyr, half goat and half man. Socrates' appearance made him a favourite target of the comic poets, who also must have gotten more than a few laughs from Socrates' unusual mannerisms. For example, Socrates would roll his eyes with his head cocked backwards as he walked through the streets of Athens. One surviving fragment from a 5th century comic poet, Amapsius, offers a depiction of Socrates that makes fun of his tattered cloak and his habit of going barefooted.
Come here, Socrates, the complete fool. Can we get you a cloak?
He is an insult to the shoemakers.
Socrates' appearance and mannerisms were not the only things that made him stand apart from his fellow Athenians. He often claimed that he heard a voice, which he sometimes called his daimonion, or divine voice. Socrates used the voice to guide his actions, and all the ancient sources about his life are in rare agreement that he was entirely convinced that the voice had a divine origin. But the sources disagree on what the voice communicated. For example, Plato insists that the voice acted only to stop Socrates from what he was about to do. It never provided positive guidance. To the contrary, Xenophon claims that Socrates' daimonion often gave positive advice. Whichever account is correct, it is plain that there was a side of Socrates that would not fit our modern conception of purely rational behaviour. At some point, Socrates married a woman named Xanthippe, who may have been from an aristocratic family. Together they had 3 sons. Some ancient sources claim that Socrates also had another wife, Myrto, but these stories should be viewed with suspicion. A second wife is not mentioned by Plato or Xenophon, our 2 best sources about the life of Socrates. If Socrates did marry twice, then Xanthippe could have been his second wife, because Plato says she was in Socrates' prison cell on the last day of his life. During Socrates' lifetime, stories were commonly told about his endurance for Xanthippe's uncontrolled temper. Xenophon offers a typical report of a conversation between Socrates and his friend Antisthenes. When Socrates claims that women can learn anything, Antisthenes asks in jest,
"Why then, Socrates, do you not educate Xanthippe? For you chose the most difficult woman of those who exist, of those who have existed, and of those who will exist."
Socrates responds with characteristic humour.
Because I see that those who wish to become horsemen do not take on the obedient horses, but rather those that are high-spirited. For they believe that if they are able to keep them in check, it will be easier to take care of the other horses. But since I wish to associate and deal with human beings, I have gotten her for myself, knowing well that if I can endure her, I can easily be with all other human beings.
Beyond these occasional unflattering glimpses, we know nothing of Socrates' relationship with Xanthippe. Socrates seems to have been on friendly terms with some of Athens' most influential citizens, in spite of his dishevelled appearance and his indifference to wealth and power. He was often invited into their homes for the evening, and many of their sons seem to have enjoyed his company during the day. He frequented the agora, the Athenian market, searching for people to engage in philosophical discussion. Plato may have first encountered Socrates in just this setting, and he later provided Socrates' explanation for why he was so popular with so many wealthy young men.
The young men who follow me, those who have the most leisure, the sons of the richest men, enjoy hearing people being examined, and they often imitate me and then try to examine others. And then I think they discover a great abundance of people who think they know something, but know little or nothing.
Some of Socrates' well-heeled friends would play important, though hardly admirable, roles in Athenian history. One such friend was Alcibiades, who became a leading political and military leader before betraying Athens at the most crucial point in her death struggle with Sparta. Socrates' friends also included Critias and Charmides, 2 of the most evil men in Athenian history. Immediately after Athens surrendered to Sparta, Critias and Charmides led the so-called 30 tyrants in a murderous reign over Athens. Socrates has been blamed for shaping the fate of these men, and the extent of his responsibility remains a matter of controversy today. By the time Socrates was in his mid-40s, he was well known in Athens. When, in 423 BC, the comic poet Aristophanes first produced his play entitled Clouds, one of its central characters, as we've seen, was a buffoonish, charlatan philosopher named Socrates. The chorus describes Socrates in a way that undoubtedly is intended to be the philosopher of that same name, depicting many of the well-known characteristics of the philosopher.
You walk along the streets, rolling your eyes, barefoot, enduring many hardships. You gaze up at us, the clouds.
This play did much to spread Socrates' reputation, but Socrates must already have been well known as an intellectual of some significance. Otherwise, his portrayal as a pretender to great insights would have failed to achieve its comic effect. No one tells us why or when Socrates first became interested in philosophy, but it's likely that he perceived himself to have a religious duty to engage his fellow citizens in philosophy. Most of Socrates' fellow Athenians were traditional believers in such deities as Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, and Aphrodite. The immortal Greek gods were much more powerful than human beings, but they were driven by the same thoughts and passions as humans. Most Athenians believed that when the gods were pleased, they bestowed great good on humans. When they were angry, they imposed the greatest of evils. So it was important to stay on their good side. How did Socrates' religious mission begin? Plato tells us that one of Socrates' friends, a man named Chaerephon, travelled to the oracle at Delphi. He asked whether there was anyone wiser than Socrates, and the priestess of Apollo responded that no one is wiser than Socrates. According to Plato, here is how Socrates reacted when he heard about what the priestess had said.
When I heard these things, I was puzzled. What does the god mean? And what riddle is he setting forth? For I knew that I am wise, neither much nor little. What then does he mean in saying that I am the wisest? For clearly he is not lying. That is not possible for him. And for a long time I was puzzled about what he was saying. And then, with great reluctance, I did a turnaround and started to investigate him.
Socrates attempts to disprove the oracle by finding at least one person wiser than himself. He discovers no shortage of fellow citizens who think they know how to live, but his questioning reveals their ignorance. At least Socrates knows that he does not know how to live, and in this important sense he is wiser than they are. Socrates realizes that those who think they know how to live would be immeasurably better off if they understood their ignorance. Socrates believes that Apollo himself conveyed this message through his oracle, and he concludes that he has been given a divine mission to improve his fellow citizens.
Thus I go around even now, and seek and examine on behalf of the god any citizen or stranger I consider to be wise. And when he seems not to be, I assist the god and reveal that he is not. And from this activity I have no leisure to engage in any matter pertaining to the city worth mentioning, or to my affairs. But I am in great poverty on account of my service to the god.
Socrates knows that most of his fellow citizens have no desire to test their claims to knowledge, and when his persistent questioning reveals how little they know, they feel tricked and humiliated. In time, some of the Athenian citizens came to feel that enough was enough, and they turned their humiliation into anger. In the spring of 399 BC, when the city of Athens was once again securely in democratic hands, a man named Miletus brought criminal charges against the philosopher. Miletus seems to have been the chief prosecutor, but he was aided by two others, Anytus and Lycon, who brought legal charges against Socrates. Several centuries after Socrates' death, Favorinus, a minor teacher of rhetoric in the 1st century AD, actually saw the formal charges which had been preserved. According to the historian Diogenes Laertius, Favorinus saw charges that have a distinctly religious character.
Miletus, the son of Miletus of Pithos, wrote these things, and swears to them, about Socrates, the son of Sophroniscus, Socrates is guilty of not believing in the gods the city believes in, and of introducing new divinities into the city. He is also guilty of corrupting the youth.
Athenian juries were generally very large to prevent tampering, and Socrates' trial probably involved 500 jurors. A great throng of other Athenians often pressed around the perimeter of the court to hear the proceedings. By custom, the morning was set aside for the prosecution to present its case. Socrates presented his defence in the afternoon. Socrates' trial was called an argon timesis, which means that the penalty was not set by law. Rather, the prosecutor proposed a penalty at the end of the indictment. If convicted, the defendant proposed a counter-penalty, and the jury chose between the two. Meletus asked that Socrates be put to death, and we will see later that Socrates proposed a counter-penalty that the jury did not expect. Plato's early work, entitled Apology, purports to be an account of what Socrates says in his defence, and it is the most famous description of what Socrates said at his trial. Xenophon, the Athenian general, historian, and friend of Socrates, wrote the only other version that survives in its entirety. As many as 7 versions were written in antiquity, and there undoubtedly were others for which no record remains. Xenophon did not actually hear Socrates' speech, but he heard about it from a man named Hermogenes. According to Xenophon, Socrates never seriously attempted to convince the jury that he was innocent.
Others have written about Socrates' trial, and all happen to comment on his boastfulness, which makes it clear that Socrates really did talk that way. But they did not make clear that he had come to the conclusion that death was preferable to life, so that his boastfulness appears to have been thoughtless. Hermogenes, the son of Hipponicus, was a companion of Socrates, and gave reports about him so that his boastfulness appears fitting to his thinking that death is preferable.
Commentators generally conclude that Plato is more accurate than Xenophon in his account of what Socrates actually said to the jury. For one thing, Plato indicates that he was actually present at the trial. Still, Plato's Apology is probably not a verbatim report. According to Plato, Socrates believed he could be successful only by addressing what he calls the first accusations against him. These are the falsehoods, rumours, and innuendos that had been passed around Athens for many years. Socrates is quoted as saying,
I am in the right, men of Athens, to make a defense against the first false accusations and the first accusers, and then against the later accusations and the later accusers. For many have accused me to you for many years, although they have said nothing true. And these I fear more than those around Anytus, although they too are dangerous. But these others are more dangerous, who got hold of most of you when you were children and made accusations about me. All lies. That there is a man called Socrates, a wise man, who thinks deeply about the heavens and searches after all things below the earth, and who makes the weaker argument the stronger.
Socrates points out that 2 of the so-called first accusations can be found in Aristophanes' play Clouds. The first accusation is that Socrates is a nature philosopher who thinks everything can be explained scientifically. He leaves no room for belief in the gods. The second accusation is that Socrates is an immoral sophist, twisting things around in a way that teaches his pupils to reject the notion of ethical truth. Against the charge of atheism, Socrates can do little more than to deny that he has had anything to do with such scientific investigations. He asks the jurors if they have seen him engaging in such speculations. As for being a sophist, Socrates points out that this charge is especially ironic, since he has no knowledge to convey to anyone. What's more, his poverty is ample evidence that students do not pay him for his teaching. Socrates responds to the specific accusations at his trial by interrogating their author, Meletus. Socrates questions his accuser in a way that's typical of the wiry arguments he earlier used to expose the pretensions of his interlocutors. Meletus had formerly accused Socrates of corrupting the youth of Athens, and, according to Plato's account, Socrates defends himself with impatience and sarcasm.
Now tell us, in the name of God, Meletus, whether it is better to live among good citizens or bad. Answer, I am not asking you anything difficult. And do not bad people work some evil on those who are always near them, and the good work some good on those always near them?
Well, of course.
And is there anyone who wishes to be harmed by those who are around him rather than benefited? Answer, the law requires you to answer. Is there anyone who wishes to be harmed?
Clearly not.
Come then, do you accuse me here before the court of corrupting the youth and making them worse, voluntarily or involuntarily?
I say voluntarily.
Are you so much wiser than I am at my age, that if I shall make any of those around me bad, I shall be in danger of being harmed by him, and that I do such an evil to myself voluntarily, as you say? Well, I am not persuaded by you about that, Miletus, nor do I think any other man is either. So, either I do not corrupt the youth, or if I do so involuntarily. Either way, you are accusing me wrongly.
In part, Socrates intends to show that Miletus is accusing him in a way that is not fully thought out. But Socrates is also making the point that he would not willingly harm himself, which is precisely what he would have been doing if, as Miletus says, he had corrupted the youth. Plato's Apology is best known for Socrates' unyielding defense of the philosophical life. Socrates is convinced that by badgering people to examine their beliefs, he is far from corrupting anyone. In fact, he is their greatest benefactor. Socrates tells the jury that he steers his companions away from their less valuable material concerns and towards the most valuable concern of all, which is moral virtue.
For I go around doing nothing else but trying to persuade you, young and old, not to care for your bodies, nor your money, more than your soul, that it may be as good as possible, saying that virtue does not come from money, but from virtue come money and all other good things for men, both in private and in public.
According to Plato, Socrates is not surprised when the jury convicts him, but he is surprised by the closeness of the vote. If only 30 more votes had been cast in his favour, Socrates would have been released. Given that there were such strong prejudices against Socrates when he began his defence, the close vote was a remarkable turn of events. Miletus proposed that Socrates be executed. Socrates was given a chance to offer a counter-penalty, and he must have shocked many jurors with his response. First, he insisted that even though he had been convicted, he still did not regard himself as morally culpable. On the contrary, Socrates reminded the jurors of the great service he had done for the city.
What do I, being the person I am, deserve to pay? Well, something good, men of Athens, if I am to offer what would be fitting for me. What is fitting for a beneficent poor man who needs leisure to exhort you? There is nothing so fitting as that such a person take his meals in the Prytaneum.
Socrates was suggesting as a penalty, perhaps the greatest civic honour in Athens, receiving meals in the Prytaneum. Socrates then explained why he could not propose any penalty, including exile, that would preclude him from practicing philosophy. He said that to do so would mean abandoning what happens to be the greatest good for man. The only unharmful penalty he could think of was a fine, so he offered to pay the jury 1 mina of silver. He implied that this tiny amount was all he could raise. When 4 of his friends, including Plato himself, agreed to stand as sureties, Socrates increased the amount to 30 minas. Commentators on Plato's Apology often assume that even 30 minas was an insultingly small sum. They conclude that such an offer showed contempt for the entire proceedings. But 30 minas of silver had substantial purchasing power at the end of the 5th century BC. It was equal to about 8.5 years' wages for a typical labourer, and many of the jurors were themselves labourers. Seen in this light, this larger offer appears to be a sincere counter-proposal for the death penalty. In assessing whether or not Socrates was sincere, we should also consider other factors. These include the closeness of the jury vote, the many vows by Socrates to tell the truth to the jury, and his belief that he had a divine mission to return to the streets of Athens to practice philosophy. According to Plato's version of the trial, Socrates mounted a sincere effort to obtain his release. Instead, the jury accepted the proposal by the accuser Meletus that Socrates should be put to death. Before he was led away to the so-called Prison of the 11 to await his execution, Socrates made several final remarks to the jury. Among other things, he instructed those who voted to acquit him that they should not view his sentence as a calamity.
But it is necessary for you, O men of the jury, to be hopeful regarding death, and to bear in mind this one truth, that no harm comes to a good man in life or in death, and that his affairs are not overlooked by the gods. My affairs did not come about by chance, and it is better for me to die and to be freed from these troubles.
Socrates' trial concluded on the eve of a month-long religious festival, and Athenian law apparently forbade executions during the celebration. So Socrates had a brief reprieve, and during this time he chose, as we might guess, to do more philosophizing. When the day of execution came, Plato tells us that Socrates asked for his wife Xanthippe to be led away early in the morning. This left him to spend most of his last day on earth in philosophical conversation with his friends. At the end of the day, the jailer prepared a cup of a powerful poison, extract of hemlock. After Socrates drinks the preparation, he turns to his friend Crito and says,
"We owe a cock to Asclepius, Crito. Pay it, and do not neglect it."
In ancient Greece, when patients were cured of some disease, it was customary to show gratitude by sacrificing a cock to Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine. So the last words of Socrates probably express his conviction that death will be like a cure from the mortal suffering we endure on earth. In Plato's work entitled Apology, Socrates is especially concerned about explaining why there is so much prejudice against him. Although we've mentioned this before, it is a story worth emphasizing. Socrates says his troubles began when his friend Chaerephon went to the oracle at Delphi and asked, "Is anyone wiser than Socrates?" Socrates had been perplexed when he learned of the oracle's answer, that no one is wiser than Socrates. Socrates goes to those who have a reputation for wisdom, thinking that he will find in them the insight that he lacks. This would refute the superficial meaning of the oracle, and he would help to reveal its true, deeper meaning. Instead, Socrates is amazed to find that those who have the greatest reputation for wisdom are the least wise. They fancy themselves to be wise, when in fact they know little or nothing of value. Socrates is wiser than these other men because at least he recognizes that he is not wise. Socrates goes to the politicians, and then the poets, and then the artisans. It is always the same. All think they are very wise about important things, but all are ignorant. At the end of his investigation, Socrates realizes what the oracle meant.
It seems likely that the god is really wise, and by his oracle he meant this: human wisdom is of little or no value. And it seems he does not really say this of Socrates, but just uses my name and makes an example of me, as if to say, "This one of you, O human beings, is wisest who, like Socrates, understands that he is really worthless in regard to wisdom."
Based on this interpretation of the oracle, Socrates came to believe that he had been given a mission from the gods, a mission to expose the conceit of his countrymen who think they are very wise. In fact, they were, as Socrates says, worthless in regard to wisdom. He undertakes his mission by engaging others in conversations, which have become famous because they are either recalled or imitated in Plato's dialogues. Socrates encourages others to state their opinions, then he asks questions in a way that exposes to the opinion holder and anyone nearby that the opinion might not be so reliable or well-founded after all. This method of philosophical questioning has come to be called the Socratic elenchus, a form of argument that exposes contradictions. It is more simply known as the Socratic method of teaching. But many people have questioned whether Socrates had anything so sophisticated as a method at his disposal. Perhaps he was simply asking pointed and probing questions. Socrates sensed the weaknesses in the answers he was given, and he made these weaknesses apparent. He exposed the confusions in people's opinions or beliefs, thus revealing their ignorance. After all, if they were really wise, they could at least be expected to maintain a consistent position. Only then could they presume to instruct others. In many of Plato's dialogues, we find encounters between Socrates and the famous teachers of ancient Athens. As we might expect, he exposed their abilities and teachings as ignorance and fakery. The same result occurred when Socrates talked with other proud or powerful men. Invariably, they were revealed as ignorant, and the basis for their pride and power was shown to be a sham. It is no wonder that Socrates became hated by those whose ignorance he had publicly revealed. So, exactly how did Socrates manage to be so effective at exposing the ignorance of others? In many of Plato's dialogues, Socrates takes on the specific moral claims of his interlocutors. Often these are unconventional moral claims, and Socrates shows that maintaining them would require profound revisions in ordinary morality. In other dialogues, Socrates challenges moral claims that somehow are intrinsically inconsistent or unacceptable. Here, Socrates typically reveals one of two weaknesses. Either the interlocutor cannot sincerely advocate all of the results that his view implies, or the position is in some way shown to be self-defeating or unacceptable. So, the Socratic method is clearly a powerful way of revealing ignorance. But can it bring knowledge as well? This is the question to which we'll now turn. Socrates often expressed admiration for the inscription at the Oracle of Delphi, "Know thyself." And it may be in the area of knowing oneself that the Socratic method produces the most useful knowledge. Here and there in Plato's dialogues, Socrates suggests that his interlocutors fall into confusion because they don't understand their own beliefs. And he says that such ignorance can extend to everyone. Each of us can fail to adequately understand our own genuine beliefs. Socrates' questions often led his interlocutors to embrace conclusions that they otherwise would never accept. Socrates insisted that each person should always answer the question with what they believe, so the interlocutors had to acknowledge that their admissions were their own beliefs. But when these beliefs conflicted with their original claims, the interlocutors were able to recognize their confusions. They were able to know themselves better, for now they could discern what they really believed. The beliefs being discussed were almost always of vital moral importance, and the interlocutor could easily feel as though his whole life was under Socrates' questioning microscope. There's explicit evidence of this personal relevance in Plato's early dialogue, Laches, where one of Socrates' associates warns another,
"You do not seem to me to know that whoever is closest to Socrates and draws near into a discussion with him will necessarily not stop being led around by him in the discussion until he falls into giving an account of himself, of the way he is living now, and of the way he has lived in the past."
Socrates commonly exposed someone's ignorance by showing him that, for all of his judgments and declarations about justice or virtue or some other moral concept, he could not define what justice or virtue is. An especially interesting example of this occurs in Plato's early dialogue, Euthyphro. Here, Socrates encounters the young man named Euthyphro on the steps of the King Archon's office, where preliminary legal hearings are conducted. Euthyphro is there to attend a hearing because he has charged his own father with murder. It seems that two of the family's slaves got into a brawl, and one slave killed the other. Euthyphro's father captured the killer, then left him tied up in a ditch while he consulted the local religious authorities on how to handle the matter. While he was gone, the killer died. On this flimsy ground, Euthyphro had elected to prosecute his father for murdering the slave. Socrates first engages Euthyphro in conversation, and before long he is challenging the assumptions that must underlie such a reckless prosecution.
By Zeus, Euthyphro, do you suppose that the knowledge you have of divine things and of piety and impiety is so exacting that when things are as you say, you are not afraid of doing something impious yourself in prosecuting your father for murder?
Euthyphro replies that he does indeed have a very precise knowledge of piety and impiety. In fact, he is eager to display it to Socrates. So Socrates, ironically, offers to become Euthyphro's student.
I, my dear friend, desire to become your student. Now, for the sake of Zeus, tell me what you just said you know so clearly. What do you say piety and impiety are, as regards murder and other things? Isn't piety the same in every action, and, on the other hand, isn't impiety the opposite of all piety?
Certainly, Socrates.
Tell me then, what are piety and impiety?
Euthyphro expects to answer Socrates' questions easily, but he soon proves unable to give an account of piety. At first, Euthyphro simply tries to define piety by citing his own attempt to bring a legal action against his father. Socrates responds that merely giving an example is inadequate because it does not specify what common quality makes all pious items pious. Euthyphro then attempts to explain the common element. Every item he has listed is loved by the gods. But Euthyphro soon admits that this too doesn't work because the gods disagree. What is loved by one god may be hated by another. Euthyphro then tries to change his definition of piety to what is loved by all of the gods. Socrates now asks what has become a classic question regarding the connection between religion and ethics.
Think about this. Is what is pious loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is it pious because it is loved by the gods?
Euthyphro has already forcefully and clearly stated that piety is defined as whatever is loved by the gods. He is plainly committed to the idea that something is pious because it is loved by the gods. But Socrates shows Euthyphro that the relationship must be the other way round. Pious things are loved by the gods because they are pious. This is a subtle point, but it has resounded through the history of philosophy. At issue is the relationship between religion and morality. Both Socrates and Euthyphro agree that the gods love all moral things and that they love only moral things. A philosopher might express this by saying the gods are omnibenevolent. The gods love not only piety, the moral quality under discussion, but they also love justice, temperance, courage, wisdom, and every other good thing. So are these things good because the gods love them, or do the gods love them because they are good? If we define goodness as whatever is loved by the gods, then we are left with irresolvable paradoxes. For one thing, to say that God is good would be to say that God is self-loving, and this does not appear to be what religious people mean when they say that God is good. Moreover, if the word goodness simply means loved by God, this is all the claim that God is good could mean. Furthermore, if something is good simply because God loves it, then literally anything could be made good if God decides, for whatever reason, to love it. God could decide to love the torture or murder of an innocent child. A God that decided to love such things might also require them of us, even as a form of worship. Most religious people think that God could not possibly love horrible things. God would recognize that they are horrible and not love them precisely because they are bad. They are bad for some inherent reason, a reason other than God's choosing not to love them. So most religious people believe that good things are not good because God loves them. Rather, they believe that God loves good things because they are good. Socrates sums up the argument by saying,
Then that which is loved by the gods, Euthyphro, is not pious, nor that which is pious loved by the gods, as you say. But they are different things.
How is that, Socrates?
Because we agreed that the pious is loved by the gods on account of this, namely, that it is pious. But it is not pious because it is loved. Didn't we say that?
Yes.
So, God loves things because they are good. This belief means that we cannot sensibly define goodness in terms of what God loves, wants, or commands. The same reasoning goes in every case. God loves it, wants it, or commands it because it is good. To ascertain what is good, then we need some other basis than what God likes. At first, Euthyphro is confused by Socrates' argument.
I don't know how I can tell you what I know, Socrates. For what we establish always walks around and does not want to remain where we put it.
Despite his confusion, Euthyphro eventually understands that piety cannot be defined in terms of God's love. Euthyphro attempts to offer another definition, but this too proves to be futile, and he runs off. Perhaps he is chastened by the fact that his knowledge was a phantom. Perhaps he is simply angry, like so many of the people whom Socrates has refuted. At the very least, however, Socrates has given Euthyphro a chance to better assess the real state of his knowledge about piety. In fact, the young man doesn't know what piety is. Perhaps he should not be so quick to do things that are widely regarded as impious, such as prosecuting his father. Socrates has given Euthyphro, and us, the opportunity to see that a little moral modesty is far better than a vast but groundless moral presumption. Socrates' questioning may seem negative or destructive, but Socrates apparently regarded this approach as a powerful way of searching for moral truth. The road is not an easy one, however. No single Socratic argument suffices to show us the way. Because Socrates refutes his interlocutors, all we are left with is the knowledge that the interlocutor has failed to maintain a consistent position or to sufficiently define some moral term. But Socrates claims that looking at our views critically is indeed the most important thing we can do. He regards it as a religious mission. According to Socrates, the most important thing we can do may be to lead people to understand the limitations and inconsistencies in their beliefs.
Perhaps someone might say, "Why can't you just go away from us and live a quiet life, Socrates, without talking?" Well, for some of you, this is the most difficult thing to persuade you of. But if I tell you that to do as you say would be disobedience to the God, and therefore I cannot be quiet, you won't believe me and will think I am being insincere. And if I go on to say that this is the greatest good for a human being, to talk every day about virtue and the other things you hear me discussing, examining myself and others, and that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being, you will believe me still less. Well, this is what I say, but it is not easy to persuade you of it.
Even if no single argument or no single answer can tell us what we need to know, Socrates seems to think that living the examined life can at least improve our ignorance. One way to do this is to follow Socrates in undertaking a lifelong mission to examine our moral beliefs. In this we would examine not only the beliefs among ourselves and among those who agree with us, but also the beliefs of those who disagree with us. Such a mission would include reflecting seriously about how we should conceive of things like justice, piety, happiness, virtue, and other moral concepts. Socrates seems to think that such persistent examination might improve our understanding of things. At least we might discover which ways of thinking cannot be made to work. We may never know exactly why they can't work. That would require the kind of knowledge that Socrates himself claims to lack. But we can realize that certain ways of looking at things are not tenable. Some points of view cannot be coherently defended, no matter how hard we try. An excellent example of such an unsuccessful attempt occurs in Plato's dialogue entitled Gorgias, which was almost certainly written at the end of Plato's Socratic period. Here, two distinct interlocutors attempt to defend the idea that it is better to do an injustice than to have an injustice done to you. Socrates disagrees, arguing instead that it is better to be the victim than the perpetrator of injustice. In the Gorgias, Socrates first refutes a young man named Polus. Then the more radical Callicles proclaims what he believes to be the most fundamental moral truth, that goodness is nothing but pleasure. But Callicles soon finds his arguments crumbling under Socrates' logical onslaught. In fact, he is plainly defeated in the argument, but Socrates does not taunt his adversary. He simply explains his own position, which is that the only way to avoid appearing ridiculous is to believe that justice is always preferable to injustice.
These things, which have been made apparent to us in our earlier arguments, as I say, are held down and fastened, if I may put it in a somewhat boorish way, by reasons of iron and adamant. So at least it seems so far. And if you, or someone more vigorous than you, doesn't release them, then no one who speaks in a way other than I now speak can speak well. What I say is always the same, that I do not know how these things are. But of those I happen to meet, just as now, no one has been able to speak otherwise without being ridiculous.
Living the examined life allows us to discover that certain ways of thinking, when they are critically examined, always end up being ridiculous. Some views can, and some views cannot, be defended by reason. It's clear that Socrates himself does not think the examined life has gained him any substantial wisdom. Even at his trial, he characterized himself as really worthless in regard to wisdom, and though he occasionally defends certain specific moral claims, he never proclaims definitive knowledge. He never claims that he can provide the definitions that he so often challenges his interlocutors to produce. Wisdom, it seems, is something only a god can have. For humans, the best wisdom possible is to be aware of the fact that we have no real wisdom at all. This human wisdom, as Socrates calls it, will preserve us from the great errors of arrogance and pretentiousness. It will keep us from thinking that we are superior to others, when in fact our superiority is nothing but a sham, a supposition that we know what we really do not know. As for the rest, we must live and act as best we can. We must follow whatever path reason seems most to support. Such a life cannot be free from error, but it is the best a human being can do. Socrates was notorious among the citizens of Athens as a man of paradoxes. Those Athenians whose pretense he attacked often accused him of being an airon, that is, one who is insincere, ironical, and full of specious arguments. Many Athenians and many others in later times have doubted that Socrates was sincere in claiming to have no wisdom. This skepticism was especially common among those who found him irritating, and Socrates surely was irritating. Even he realized this. At his trial, Socrates ironically claimed that his tendency to irritate people was one of his finest attributes.
I am making my defense not for myself, as one might think, but for you, so that you will not make a terrible mistake with the god's gift by voting against me. For if you put me to death, it will not be easy to find another who, to put it in a rather absurd way, will attach himself to the city by the god, as if it were a horse, which, though large and of good breeding, is somewhat sluggish due to its size, and needs to be stirred by stinging. I think the god attached me to the city for just this sort of thing, and I never stop rousing and persuading and chastising each one of you throughout the day, wherever I find you.
Many generations of Plato's readers, right up to the present day, have found Socrates' stinging questions to be driven by more than the ignorant puzzlement, he claims. Socrates just seems too good at his job. He catches others too easily in contradictions and perplexity, all the while claiming to lack wisdom. He says he does not have the knowledge that others claim, yet he is the one who is relentlessly effective in revealing their intellectual shortcomings. Many readers have therefore believed that the Socratic claims of ignorance are nothing more than an ironical pose. They amount to a pretense that's used to entrap his victims and then to subject them to his stinging remarks. Many have wondered, if Socrates does not already know the answers, how could he be so effective in finding just the right questions to ask? In the first book of Plato's Republic, an extremely hostile young man named Thrasymachus breaks into a discussion Socrates is having with another young man named Polemarchus. Thrasymachus directly accuses Socrates of treachery.
What kind of nonsense is this, Socrates? And why do you two simpletons give in to each other like this? If you really want to know what justice is, Socrates, don't just ask questions and then subvert any answer another gives. Since you are clever enough to have discovered that it is easier to ask questions than to answer them. But go ahead and answer yourself and tell what justice is. Explain clearly and precisely whatever you say, for I won't accept any blathering generalities from you.
Socrates replies,
Thrasymachus, don't be so hard on us. If he and I have made mistakes in our reasoning about this issue, please understand that it is not willingly that we have gone wrong. For you shouldn't think that if we were looking for gold, we would never willingly give in to one another and make concessions in our search in such a way as to ruin our chances of finding it. But then, when we are looking for justice, a thing even more precious than lots of gold, we would be so stupid as to make concessions and not, instead, be as serious as we can be about discovering it. You mustn't think that, my friend. But you see, we are inept. It is more fitting for a brilliant fellow like you to take pity on us then, rather than to give us such a hard time.
By Heracles, here is the famous irony of Socrates. And just as I knew and predicted it, when it came time for you to reply, you would refuse and be ironical and do anything rather than answer some question that someone might ask you.
For Thrasymachus, the claim of ignorance by Socrates is really a type of intellectual cheating. He seems to ask questions for which he already knows the answers, just to trap people and make fun of them. Is Thrasymachus right? Should we be skeptical of this eccentric philosopher? It is Socrates' sincerity that we will examine next. Does Socrates already know the answers to the questions he asks? The suspicion has been with us for a very long time. Many of Socrates' contemporaries would have agreed with Thrasymachus, who spoke these frustrated and accusing words to Socrates.
I knew it and predicted it. When it came time for you to reply, you would refuse and be ironical and do anything rather than answer some question that someone might ask you.
This suspicion has become virtually canonized in our modern conception of the teaching technique known as the Socratic method. In this method, a teacher asks leading questions that force the students themselves to think their way through to the correct understanding of a subject. The Socratic method is often considered to be superior to lecturing because it requires the students to think for themselves. The students arrive at knowledge, with assistance of course, because they have actively worked through the problems rather than passively listening to someone who already has a correct understanding. No doubt this style of teaching got its name because the one thing Socrates did most often was to ask leading questions. So how could anyone teach this way effectively without already having some answer in mind? It's important to be cautious about supposing that Socrates used what we now call the Socratic method of teaching. One reason for caution is that Socrates always claims that he does not have the knowledge he is pursuing in his conversations. Other teachers who use the Socratic method may occasionally and playfully claim not to know what the right answers are, but few students are fooled by their pose. By contrast, Socrates proclaims his ignorance, and he often proclaims it in situations where such a pose would have no teaching purpose. In other words, he does not just profess ignorance as he lures others into a trap, he also confesses his ignorance at the end of the conversations that have ended in failure. And he sometimes shows despair and frustration when conversations have seemed to lead in fruitless circles. Socratic teachers, as they are called, do know the answers to their questions. Socrates often seems genuinely not to know. In fact, he made this claim of ignorance the centre of his defence at his trial. There is a second reason for caution. If Socrates does have the knowledge that his questions are trying to elicit, we would be forced to conclude that he is a terrible teacher, because Socrates' interlocutors usually end up just confused and annoyed. In Plato's earlier dialogues, no one seems to learn anything positive at all. Whatever Socrates is doing, he is not leading his interlocutors in the way a so-called Socratic teacher leads a student. Socrates seems to be sincere in professing his ignorance. Admittedly, he often deploys his ignorance to prepare haughty and arrogant victims for his penetrating questions, but this does not invalidate his claim. It is important to realize that Socrates' profession of ignorance does not make him a skeptic. He does not deny that knowledge is possible for human beings, nor does he claim to lack all forms of knowledge himself. Quite to the contrary. Socrates acknowledges that people do have many sorts of knowledge, and he claims some types of knowledge for himself. For example, he acknowledges that artisans know their crafts and reliably produce their wares. But like others, artisans are unwise because they don't know their own limitations.
The good craftsmen seem to me to make the same mistake as the good poets. Because he performs his craft well, each considered himself to be wisest about other things, the most important things. And this error of theirs obscured their wisdom. So that I asked myself, on behalf of the oracle, whether I should prefer to be as I am, neither wise with respect to their wisdom, nor ignorant with respect to their ignorance, or to have both things that they have. I then answered myself, and the oracle, that it is better to be as I am.
Exactly what are these other things that are beyond the wisdom of Socrates or the craftsman? Here, Socrates is probably referring to wisdom or understanding about the most important ethical terms. Neither Socrates, nor Thrasymachus, nor the craftsman know what justice is, neither Socrates nor Euthyphro nor the craftsman know what piety is, and so on. What makes Socrates the wisest of men is that, unlike Euthyphro and the craftsman, he doesn't think he knows what these most important things are. He reveals the ignorance of others with his questioning, and he acknowledges his own ignorance from the outset. Our puzzle remains. If Socrates is ignorant, how can he be so good at questioning others? Of course, Socrates is like the craftsman in that his ignorance is not complete. He does know some things, and he employs his knowledge in conversations with others. For example, Socrates famously proclaims that he knows nothing about what might come after death. In speaking to the jury that would convict him, he contrasted this ignorance about the afterlife with his knowledge that it is evil and disgraceful to do wrong and to disobey a superior, whether God or man. In Plato's work entitled Apology, Socrates makes this point.
Perhaps I am different from most men in this way. If I say I am wiser, namely that in not knowing much about Hades, I do not think that I know. But I do know that to do injustice and to disobey one's superior is evil and disgraceful, and I will never fear and flee from what may turn out to be goods before what I know to be evils.
Socrates says he will not abandon his religious mission as a gadfly, even if it costs his life. With this conviction, he refutes those who try to persuade him to stop his irritating philosophizing. But Socrates also has a great deal of experience in discussing what he calls the most important things. Even if he does not know what justice is, by leading the examined life, he can determine what justice is not. He can examine many points of view, and he can determine that some of them cannot be maintained. Socrates' long experience allows him to recognize that what he calls the reasons of iron and adamant support certain views and refute others. In fact, careful reflection shows that some views are simply ridiculous. According to Socrates, such experience does not produce what he calls knowledge or wisdom. After all, tomorrow a new argument might overturn one's view on some matter. Take the concept of justice as an example. Unless Socrates can come to know what justice is, he will never be an unerring judge of what is just and what is not just. To know what justice is would make Socrates wise, and Socrates denies that he has any such knowledge. He may know that certain cases are assuredly just or unjust, such as disobeying one's superiors, but knowing the justice of one case does not make Socrates an infallible judge of all cases. Analogies and comparisons between cases could turn out to be false. To avoid error, Socrates is convinced that he would have to know what justice is, in and of itself. When he calls himself ignorant, what Socrates means is that he does not know what justice is, and that he does not know what the other most important things are. He may be able to judge individual cases. In fact, he shows no hesitation in judging a great many cases. Moreover, his depth of experience in leading the examined life gives him a great advantage in arguing with others. It permits him to ask just the right questions and to reveal the ignorance of those who think they know. But despite all his experience and learning, Socrates is significantly short of his ultimate goal of definitive knowledge, or what he calls wisdom. He may get endlessly closer and closer to his goal, but Socrates believes that only the gods are truly wise. Since the age known as the Enlightenment swept Europe in the 18th century, Western ethics has been concerned primarily with seeking the right principles by which to guide our actions. For the philosophers of ancient Greece, ethics was typically an investigation of happiness, or what they called eudaimonia. What is happiness, and how can it be acquired? Greek philosophers simply assumed that people take happiness, or what they sometimes describe as doing well or living well, to be the ultimate goal of all actions. We see how deeply ingrained this assumption is in a remark that Socrates makes in Plato's early dialogue, Euthydemus.
Then do all men wish to do well? Or is this question one of those ridiculous ones we were afraid of just now? Isn't it clearly absurd to ask such things? Is there anyone who does not wish to do well?
To enjoy the fullest degree of eudaimonia, many Greeks assume that one must first attain arete, which means virtue or excellence. But the Greeks disagree about what arete is. Socrates established the course of the debate by arguing that arete is really moral arete. He says a person is happiest only if he or she acquires moral virtue. For many Greeks, this idea alone was hard enough to swallow, but Socrates was even more at odds with common Greek opinion when he said that moral virtue has nothing to do with wealth or power or prestige. He said it is really a kind of knowledge. Moral virtue enables a person to distinguish good from evil, and it enables one to explain why something is good and why something is evil. To illustrate what he has in mind, Socrates often draws analogies between virtue and various crafts, such as medicine or architecture, which are also types of knowledge. It was not at all unusual for Socrates to question someone at length about the characteristics of crafts in order to make a point about the nature of virtue. Consider an interchange that Socrates had with Euthyphro, a self-styled expert on religious law who turns out to be phony and self-deceived. Socrates begins by asking,
Can you tell me what product the craft of the physicians happens to produce? Isn't it health?
Clearly.
And what is the product of the shipbuilder's craft?
Ships, obviously.
And the house builder produces a house?
Yes.
Socrates uses these maddeningly commonplace examples to demonstrate that knowing a craft's goal should allow us to understand what knowledge the craft requires. For example, by knowing something about the goals of medicine, when we discover the goals that virtue seeks, we can then know what knowledge the doctor must have. Similarly, we can know what knowledge a virtuous person must have. Euthyphro, like those who converse with Socrates in Plato's early dialogues, is unable to give Socrates an acceptable answer about the goal or purpose of virtue. When the dialogue ends, it's apparent that no one yet understands what sort of knowledge is needed by a virtuous person. But at the end of another dialogue, entitled Laches, Socrates seems confident that virtue is concerned with good and evil. He tells the famous general Nicias,
Do you think there could be anything missing from the virtue of such a one who knew all good things, and everything about how they come about, and will come about, and came about, and similarly about evils? Do you think such a person would be lacking in either temperance or justice and piety, when it belongs to this man alone to be able to distinguish what is and is not to be feared regarding the gods and men, and the gaining of good things, since he would know the right way to be concerned with these things?
So what is happiness concerned with? On this topic, Plato's dialogue entitled Gorgias is especially helpful. Here, Socrates handily refutes the claim by Callicles that happiness, or what Callicles calls doing well, is just a matter of feeling pleasure. This was a popular and widely held notion in his own day, just as it is in ours, but Socrates challenged it.
Well, do you say it is impossible to do well and do ill at the same time?
I do say so.
But you agree that it is possible to enjoy oneself when one is in pain.
It appears so.
Then enjoyment is not the same as faring well, nor is feeling pain the same as faring ill, with the result that pleasure is different from the good.
For Socrates, happiness is not a feeling at all. It is a matter of how we act, and he describes happiness as acting well.
The good man acts well and nobly in whatever he does, and the one who acts well is blessed and happy, whereas the bad man who acts wickedly is miserable.
If Socrates is right, then virtue is a kind of knowledge about what it means to act well. This is not to say that Socrates thinks virtue guarantees that we will always act well. Indeed, virtue cannot guarantee happiness. Socrates says elsewhere that there are goods other than virtue, such as health, prosperity, and even physical attractiveness. So if happiness consists in acting properly, then these other non-moral goods must be valuable because they enable us to act rightly. Without these other goods, right action would be difficult or impossible. So Socrates seems to think that to be happy, we must have a full range of goods or advantages. But Socrates is careful to point out that such things as health and wealth do not stand on the same moral plane as virtue. He notes that other goods such as wealth or good looks can be used for evil purposes.
It seems likely that the whole collection, health, wealth, and good looks, that we at first said are good things, are not goods by nature, but rather it looks as if any of them is led by ignorance, they are greater evils than their opposites, inasmuch as they are more able to serve an evil leader. But if intelligence and wisdom guide them, they are greater goods. In themselves, they are of no value.
Socrates' point is that only moral wisdom is good by its very nature. It is the only thing whose very nature always makes a person better off. Other things such as health and wealth can be good, but they are good only if they are employed rightly. Their goodness is not intrinsic. They are good only if they are used correctly. And this, in turn, requires moral wisdom. Does moral virtue have value even if we are deprived of all other goods? Is moral virtue alone enough to guarantee at least a modicum of happiness? Many interpreters have claimed that Socrates was indeed endorsing the value of moral virtue alone when he made this famous statement in Plato's early dialogue entitled Apology.
No harm comes to a good man in life or in death.
But this common interpretation is almost certainly mistaken. In an early dialogue entitled Crito, Socrates clearly implies that disease can render life to be no longer worth living. He asks Crito if it's worth living when one has a diseased or corrupted body.
Come then, if we ruin what becomes better by health and is destroyed by disease, because we listen to the opinion of the ignorant, is life worth living? And that thing is the body, is it not? And is life worth living with a diseased and corrupted body?
Crito's answer is never, and Socrates agrees. Much the same point is made towards the end of the dialogue entitled Gorgias. Here Socrates explains why ship captains should not think they have necessarily done their passengers a great favour by guiding them safely through the dangers on the sea.
If anyone afflicted with great and incurable diseases of the body is not drowned, he is miserable at not having been killed, and he has not benefited from the safe passage he has been given.
Moral virtue cannot protect the body from disease, and a disease that's chronically disabling can make someone very unhappy. So Socrates concludes that moral virtue alone cannot guarantee happiness. His comments about the relationship between virtue and happiness imply that sometimes even the virtuous are better off dead. So what can it possibly mean for Socrates to say that a good man cannot be harmed in life or in death? We've already seen that Socrates believes human beings have souls, which are radically different kinds of things from our bodies. A soul may become better off or worse off due to something that doesn't touch the body. Similarly, something that helps or harms the body may leave the soul untouched. So in saying that no harm comes to a good man, Socrates probably means that nothing can damage a good man's soul. We know that Socrates appears to reject the idea that moral virtue can guarantee happiness, but is virtue necessary for happiness? In other words, can a person who is not virtuous ever become happy? It's worth noting that Socrates professed to lack the moral wisdom that's necessary for virtue, so if virtue is necessary for happiness, then Socrates must not have been happy, even if he lived a life that was free from injustice. An even greater paradox is that if Socrates were to say that virtue is necessary for happiness, he would have to infer that no one else in Athens is happy either. He has examined a great many people as a part of his divine mission, and no one has been able to pass his tests. In Plato's Apology, Socrates' final speech to the jury strongly suggests that a person can be happy without virtue. Socrates also seems to regard himself as happy. After being convicted and sentenced to die, Socrates tells those who voted for his acquittal that they should be hopeful about death.
Either death is nothingness and the end of all perception, or it happens to be a change, as they say, and a migration of the soul from this place here to another place. If it is the end of perception, like sleep, in which the sleeper sees not a single dream, death would be a wonderful gain. But if death is a move from here to another place, and what they say is true, that all the dead are there, what greater good could there be? What would you give to examine the leader of the great army against Troy, or Odysseus, or Sisyphus, or the multitude of others, men and women, I might mention? To converse with, and be with, and to examine those there would be an indescribable happiness.
Of course, Socrates is not claiming to know which of the two possibilities will occur at death, but he thinks that anyone should be happy to examine those who exist in the underworld. Socrates cannot plausibly believe that one suddenly acquires moral virtue at death, so he must think that it is possible to be happy without virtue, provided that there is philosophical examination. If this is right, then Socrates has good reason to count himself as happy in this life. After all, he engages whenever he can in the very thing that he says would make for happiness in the afterlife. This is not to say that Socrates regards his happiness as equal to what the truly virtuous would enjoy. He views the knowledge possessed by the virtuous as analogous to that possessed by a craftsman. For example, an architect knows not only which columns will support a given edifice, he also knows which columns will do so most effectively. To know architecture, then, is to know what is the best sort of structure in light of the user's needs and the quality of the materials at hand. Similarly, Socrates believes that moral knowledge is knowing the best moral course out of the countless options available. Socrates' life of right conduct allows him to say he is happy, but he has no reason to think that he is engaging in the best actions possible. His life and his happiness is inferior to that of the virtuous, if such persons exist. Socrates often talks about moral virtue as if it is one thing, but he is perfectly comfortable talking about the many individual virtues: wisdom, self-control, courage, justice, and piety. So what is the relationship of these individual virtues to each other and to virtue as a whole? In Plato's dialogue entitled Protagoras, Socrates poses this very question to the great sophist Protagoras.
Are the 5 names, wisdom, temperance, courage, justice, and piety, names for the same thing? Or is there some individual essence that underlies each, and a thing that has its own function, so that it is not possible for each to be different from the others?
Protagoras holds the common sense view that each of the virtues is essentially different. It is like a part of the face. Socrates recapitulates Protagoras' view.
You said that they are not names attached to a single being, but that each of these names refers to a distinct thing. and that all are parts of virtue, not as pieces of gold are like each other and to the whole of which they are parts, but like the parts of the face, unlike the whole of which they are parts, and unlike each other, each having its own individual function.
But what does Socrates himself think? Today, most scholars agree that at least in his conversation with Protagoras, Socrates thinks the virtues are more like pieces of gold. They are essentially the same thing. To have any one of the virtues is ipso facto to have all of the virtues, or what we might call the whole of virtue. Socrates thus accepts what has been called the unity of the virtues. This notion that the virtues are unified is confirmed by a discussion between Socrates and the Athenian general Nicias in Plato's dialogue entitled Laches. Here, Nicias begins by saying that he thinks courage is only a part of virtue, and he defines courage as the knowledge of what is to be feared and dared. Socrates quickly points out that fearing and daring pertain to the future, while knowledge of something applies to past, present, and future.
It seems to me that about the things to which knowledge pertains, there is not one knowledge of how something came about, and another of how something comes about, and still another of what has not yet happened, but might or will happen in the best way. Really, it is the same knowledge for all three. For example, concerning health, medicine, one thing oversees what comes about, what has come about, and what will come about. And concerning the things that are produced by the earth, farming oversees in the same way. And surely, in matters pertaining to war, you yourself will be my witness that generalship best forecasts the other matters and what will happen. So, if you agree with me, you will think that courage is knowledge not only of what is to be feared and dared, but it comprehends what happens and what will happen, and in all ways, just as is true of the other branches of knowledge. And now, as it seems, according to your own account, knowledge is not of what is to be feared and dared, but of virtually all goods and evils in every way.
It's not clear whether Socrates thinks anyone can actually have such broad powers of discernment. After all, if the virtues are unified, as Socrates says they are, then anyone would have to have a fantastically vast range of experience and expertise in order to qualify as a morally virtuous person. In Socrates' time, as in our own, many people recognized what was in their own best interest, but failed to do it. We might call this phenomenon weakness of will, but the Greeks called it akrasia. Examples of this are endless. People know they should stop smoking, but choose to go on even while knowing it harms their health. Many people know they should read good literature, but they continue to watch as much television as ever. People say they should lose weight, but they continue to eat excessively. According to Aristotle, Socrates denies that weakness of will really exists, and he considers the examples that supposedly illustrate such a thing to be importantly misleading. Aristotle reports,
Some say that it is impossible to have knowledge that something is wrong, and yet to act against that knowledge. It would be strange, so Socrates thought, that if, when one has knowledge, something else would control it and drag it about like a slave. Socrates was completely opposed to the view, holding instead that there is no such thing as akrasia. No one decides to act contrary to what he thinks is best, but does so through ignorance.
how can Socrates make such an extraordinary conclusion? Consider his discussion with Meno, who initially expresses the conventional view that people sometimes act against their interests. Socrates begins,
Do all men seem to you to desire good things?
No, indeed.
Some desire evil things?
Yes.
Believing the evils to be goods, do you mean? Or knowing that they are evil, they nevertheless desire them?
There are both sorts of persons, it seems to me.
And does one who selects an evil believe that he is benefited by it, or does he know that it harms the one who possesses it?
There are those who believe they are benefited by the evil, and those who know they are harmed by it.
Well then, the one who desires evil, as you say, believing it will harm the one who gets it, do they know they will be harmed by it?
Necessarily.
And do they think that those who are harmed are miserable, insofar as they are harmed?
This too must be.
Are the miserable unhappy?
I think so.
Now, Socrates proceeds to the core of his argument.
But is there anyone who wants to be miserable and unhappy?
I don't think so.
Then, Meno, no one wants evil things if he does not want to be unhappy. For what is misery, other than desiring evils and procuring them?
Socrates is driven to claim that no one is ever weak-willed, and his impulse to do this is sometimes called his extreme intellectualism. Socrates believes that every desire aims at what a person takes to be his or her own good. Thus, whenever people knowingly act in a harmful way, as when they overeat, Socrates says they really believe the practice to be in their overall interest. Socrates is essentially saying that wickedness always results from ignorance. The wicked simply fail to grasp that vice is bad for them. Socrates spent his life examining others, and his experiences convinced him that the best thing you can do for yourself is to pursue moral virtue. The worst thing you can do is to become morally corrupt. In light of this conviction, it is not surprising to hear Socrates say that tyrants who use their power to harm others are not really doing what they want to do. Although they don't realize it, the tyrants are actually harming themselves, which no one wants to do. In Plato's dialogue entitled Gorgias, Socrates makes this point in a conversation with a young man named Polus. Socrates begins,
We want the good, as you say, and we do not want what is neither good nor evil, nor do we want evil. Then, if we agree on these points, if someone kills another, or casts him out of the city, or seizes his money, whether he is a tyrant or an orator, thinking it is better for him to do so, though he happens to do what is evil, such a person does what he thinks is right for him, doesn't he?
Yes.
But is it what he wants if it happens to be evil? Why do you not answer?
No, it doesn't seem to me that he does what he wants.
Does such a person have the power to do great things in that city? If great power is something good, according to what you have agreed to?
He does not.
This interchange shows how Socrates' conversations can lead to conclusions or beliefs that are utterly at odds with those of most people. Of course, he agrees with most people that being well off requires getting what one wants. But if Socrates is right, those who harm others with impunity are actually harming themselves, even though they think they are getting what they want. They only have the illusion of getting what they want, when what they really want is to be happy. But this requires moral virtue, which is the last thing they say they want. People who harm others fail to pursue what they really want because of their ignorance. They simply don't know that virtue is what is really good for them. Socrates' concept of moral virtue has profound implications for politics. In Athens, as Socrates knew it, there were two major competing political factions. First, there were the oligarchs, who wanted only landowners to be Athenian citizens. The oligarchs typically sympathized with the authoritarian culture of Sparta. The second major political group in ancient Athens was composed of the Democrats, who favored a much broader participation in every aspect of Athenian political life. The Democrats were almost invariably hostile to Sparta. Some scholars have argued that Socrates was an avid oligarch, while others have argued that he was a friend of democracy. Plato's Apology seems to tell us that Socrates belonged to neither faction. He simply has no politics. According to the Apology, Socrates claimed that his daimonion warned him away from an active life of politics. If we listen carefully, we see that Socrates' remarks in the Apology do not settle the question of which political faction he supported.
Do you think I could have carried on so many years if I acted in public settings, and in doing what a good man does, I lent aid to the just, and attached the greatest importance to this? Not at all. Nor could any other man.
Socrates' refusal to act in the political arena is entirely consistent with supporting either of the two major parties. So the question remains, did the principles held by Socrates incline him to favour one political faction over the other? Xenophon portrayed Socrates as being clearly hostile to democracy. He reported a conversation in which Socrates berated Charmides for being needlessly bashful about speaking before the assembly.
You are ashamed to speak before the most senseless and weak people. Are you shamed by the fullers, or the cobblers, or the builders, or the smiths, or the merchants, or those who change money in the marketplace and who think about buying low and selling high? For the assembly is made up of these people.
According to Xenophon's account, Socrates thought that allowing the common folk to run the affairs of state is not just unwise, it is dangerous. Some historians have suspected that Xenophon's portrait of Socrates merely reflected Xenophon's own hostility to democracy. But we also find some of the same attitude ascribed to Socrates in the pages of Plato. Plato portrays Socrates as one who loses few opportunities to criticize the judgment of hoi polloi, or average people, and these are the very people that the Athenian democrats thought should make up the government. According to Plato, Socrates said,
"Concerning right and wrong, and the disgraceful and the noble, and the good and the bad, ought we to follow and fear the opinion of the majority, or that of the one individual, if there is one, who can advise us, whom it is necessary to hold in respect more than all the others? Unless we follow him, we will destroy and maim that which is benefited by justice and is ruined by injustice."
In this passage, it could not be clearer that Plato's Socrates thinks the opinions of the majority are actually dangerous. If we take their opinion seriously, we risk ruining our souls. In Plato's writings, Socrates has two favourite refrains. The first is that the soul is benefited by justice and injured by injustice. The second is that hoi polloi hold dangerously misguided views of what justice and injustice really are. The implication, then, is starkly anti-democratic. Socrates thinks that most people are unfit for political power. But it doesn't follow from this anti-democratic bias that Socrates instead favours oligarchy. Some observers have noted that Socrates was friendly with two of the most notorious Athenian oligarchs, Critias and Charmides. These men later led the so-called 30 tyrants who subjected Athens to a reign of terror. But while Socrates may have admired the intellectual capacities of these two friends, there is no independent evidence that he approved of their political views. There's also no evidence that the friendship endured after they took control of the city. In fact, in his speech to the jury, Socrates reports that he had openly defied the 30 when they had ordered him to engage in injustice.
"The 30 once summoned me as a fifth person into the rotunda, and they ordered me to bring back a certain Leon of Salamis, so that they could kill him. They gave many such orders to many people, since they wished to implicate as many as possible in their crimes. But then I, not by word but by deed, showed that death mattered nothing to me. But it mattered everything to me that I do nothing unjust or impious."
Socrates opposed democracy particularly because it places power in the hands of persons who know nothing about justice and injustice. Oligarchy is based on the assumption that owning property makes you suited to participate in politics, but this doesn't guarantee a knowledge of justice either. In fact, Socrates' interrogations lead him to conclude that the wealthy are as likely as anyone else to be self-deceived about the most important moral matters. We may conclude from all this that Socrates endorses neither democracy nor oligarchy. He does strongly prefer rule by moral experts, but there's little reason to expect that anyone will ever acquire the moral wisdom needed to be virtuous. although it would be misleading to say either that Socrates was a democrat or an oligarch, there is some reason to think that of these two options he favours democracy. One of the basic characteristics of Athenian democracy was its commitment to what they termed parrhesia, or freedom of speech. As Athenians saw it, democracy means that all citizens are political equals, and this requires that all citizens have the same right to say what is on their minds. As long as democratic Athens remained true to her values, Socrates could engage in philosophy. But as his trial and execution shows, even democratic Athens had her limits. Socrates tells the jury that no other Greek city would have allowed him to speak freely either.
A fine life I would have, a man at my age, going away and passing from one city to the next, always being driven out. Know well that wherever I would go, young men will listen to what I say, just as here. And if I drive them away, they will persuade their elders to drive me away. And if I do not drive them away, their fathers and relatives will drive me away on account of these young people.
In Plato's dialogue entitled Crito, Socrates imagines the laws of Athens speaking to him. The laws remind him that he chose to live in Athens his entire life.
But you chose neither Sparta nor Crete, which you are always saying are well governed, nor any of the other Greek cities, nor any barbarian city. But you left home less than the lame and the blind and other disabled people. Thus, it is clear that the city and we its laws are loved by you so much more than other citizens.
As long as democratic Athens is more tolerant of his philosophical pursuits than other cities would have been, Socrates has reason to stay there. Socrates, therefore, has a reason to choose democracy over other forms of government, in spite of what he sees as democracy's flaws. Socrates believes that democracies are likely to pass bad laws, so the question is, are we morally obligated to obey those bad laws? Plato's dialogues seem not to provide a consistent answer. In the Apology, for example, Socrates tells the jury what he would do if they abridged his freedom of speech by ordering him to stop engaging in philosophical examination.
If you were to say to me, Socrates, we will not now be persuaded by Anytus, but will let you go on this condition. You will no longer spend your time in investigation or philosophy, and if you are discovered doing this again, you will be put to death. If then you would release me on these conditions, as I say, I would tell you that I respect you and I love you, men of Athens. But I will be persuaded by the god more than by you. And as long as I draw breath and am able, I shall not stop engaging in philosophy.
Some commentators have argued that Socrates is clearly announcing in this passage that there is at least one order he would violate, and that is an order to stop engaging in philosophy. These scholars also argue that Socrates recognizes one type of law, the law of God, as being higher than any human law. When divine law and human law conflict, the lower human law must give way to the higher divine one. On the other hand, in Crito, Socrates apparently defends the opposite view, declaring that he is bound to follow Athenian law at all costs, even if it costs his very life. As the dialogue opens, Socrates' friend, Crito, comes to him in prison while he is awaiting execution. Crito is a man of some means, and he tells Socrates that he is willing to make the necessary arrangements to allow his escape. Socrates answers by asking Crito to imagine with him what the laws of Athens would say about this plan to escape.
You should either persuade the city, or do whatever she commands, and suffer if she commands you to suffer, keeping silent, to be beaten or imprisoned, or if she leads you to war, to be wounded or killed. You must do these things. It is just to do them, and you must not give way or retreat, or abandon your position. But in war and in the law court and everywhere, you must do whatever your city and country commands, or persuade her as to what is naturally just.
As Socrates conceives the laws, they do not require blind obedience. The laws recognize that they can be mistaken. Moreover, the laws remind Socrates again that he chose to live under them. He could have gone elsewhere, but he stayed in Athens. Socrates imagines what the law would say about this.
We proclaim, by having created this opportunity to any Athenian who wishes, when he has become a man and has seen the ways of the city and us the laws, he may take up his possessions and go wherever he wants. Not a single law forbids him or stands in his way. If any of you wish to go to a colony, if we and the city are not pleasing, or to go somewhere else to live as an alien.
By electing to stay, Socrates has received great benefits from life in Athens.
Did we not give you birth? And through us did not your father marry your mother and engender you? Tell us. Do you find anything wrong with those of us, the laws that concern marriage? Or with those that concern the nurture of a child and the education in which you were educated? Did those laws not give orders correctly about these things when they ordered your father to educate you?
Socrates' point here is that individuals and the state will always have disputes about what justice requires, and no state can survive such disputes unless there is some authoritative way to determine who is right. According to Socrates, the laws demand that they should rightfully prevail in such disputes. After all, Socrates implicitly agreed to live under these laws when he continued to stay in Athens. In some ways, this argument in Crito seems simply inconsistent with what Socrates says in Apology. In Crito, Socrates is arguing for the authority of the law, but in Apology, he vows to never abandon his divinely imposed duty to philosophize, even if the law demands it. Isn't this simply a contradiction? The answer, surprisingly, is no, because the jury has no authority to order Socrates to abandon philosophizing. They are required by law to choose between the sentence suggested by Meletus, who proposed that Socrates be put to death, and the counter-proposal by Socrates that he pay a fine of 30 minas. The assembly could not have issued a valid order for Socrates to stop engaging in philosophy. Socrates believed the god had ordained him to philosophize. He would have considered an order to cease philosophizing to be a violation of the Athenian law forbidding impiety. It should be emphasized that Socrates is not saying that a citizen must always obey the law in each and every circumstance. On the contrary, Socrates makes it clear that the persuade or obey doctrine applies only when certain conditions are met. The citizen must have the right to argue that the law is wrong, and the legal system must aim at producing justice, even though particular laws within that system may sometimes be unjust. Socrates' position about obeying the law, therefore, does not apply to certain totalitarian regimes. But where the proper conditions are met, and when the citizen fails to persuade those who make and enforce the law, Socrates thinks that justice requires the citizen to do what the law commands. This reasoning has not been universally adopted, especially in modern times. In his essay entitled Civil Disobedience, the American philosopher and essayist Henry David Thoreau argued that the citizen has only one obligation: to scrupulously follow his or her conscience. Thoreau says it is irrelevant whether or not one has benefited from the legal system, or whether or not the legislature is trying to pass a just ordinance.
Must the citizen, for a moment, or in the least degree, resign his conscience to the legislator? Why has every man a conscience, then? I think we should be men first, and subjects afterwards. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law, so much as for the right. The only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think is right.
Indeed, Thoreau believes that when a legal command offends a citizen's conscience, it's not even necessary for that citizen to explain why he or she cannot comply. In the 20th century, Martin Luther King also argued that a citizen has a right and, indeed, a duty not to obey an unjust law. But unlike Thoreau, King tied this right to a theory of natural law.
One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is not a law.
Of course, this raises an important question. How does someone determine whether a law is just or unjust? According to the 13th century philosopher and theologian St. Thomas Aquinas,
an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and the natural law.
a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or with the law of God. An unjust law is therefore a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. In other words, any law that uplifts human personality is just, and any law that degrades human personality is unjust. Socrates differs from those who advocate civil disobedience, such as Thoreau and King, in at least two ways. First, Socrates believes that obedience to the law, even if it seems unjust, is our only reasonable assurance against anarchy. No society would agree to let every citizen decide for himself where justice lies and whether to obey the law. A citizen who is free to leave, but who has chosen to live in a particular civil and legal order, has implicitly agreed to let the state decide whether the law is just. If Socrates is right, modern thinkers like Thoreau and King have failed to recognize this implicit agreement about how to adjudicate legal and moral disputes. A second difference is that advocates of civil disobedience believe that a person who carries out an unjust law is himself acting unjustly. By contrast, Socrates believes that if a person obeys an unjust law, then the injustice lies with the law, not with the citizen who obeys it. Socrates' counsel is clear. If you cannot, in conscience, comply with the law, and if you cannot persuade the authorities to change the laws, then you must leave the city, state, or country that's responsible for the unacceptable laws. The debate between Socrates and Dr. King, then, would likely be over whether it is unjust to remain in a country if one cannot, in good conscience, obey its laws. A common thread that runs through all of Socrates' thought involves religion. Socrates was tried, convicted, and condemned to death on the charge that he was impious. The three specifications of this charge were that he did not believe in the gods that the state believed in, that he invented new divinities, and that he corrupted the youth. Scholars used to think that these religious charges were made to hide the true political motivations behind the prosecution, but more recent arguments show that the religious charges were probably the actual focus of Socrates' trial. The key question becomes, exactly how are the prosecutors able to convince the Athenian jurors that Socrates is criminally impious? In Plato's Apology, Socrates clearly denies all the charges in his comments to the jury. He goes so far as to characterize himself not only as innocent of the charges, but even more innocent than his accusers are. He reminds the jurors of their oaths to judge according to the law and justice. He also explains why he would not convince them to break their holy oaths, even if it might lead to his release.
Clearly, if I would persuade you and force you to break your oaths, I would teach you not to believe there are gods. And in making my defense, I should really accuse myself of not believing in the gods. But that is not at all the way it is. I do believe in them, O men of Athens, more than my accusers do. And I leave it to you and to the God to judge regarding me, and decide what will be best for me and for you.
Like Plato, Xenophon regards Socrates as entirely innocent of the charges.
I am amazed, therefore, how the Athenians could have been persuaded that Socrates was not temperate regarding the gods, when he never did anything impious against the gods, neither by word nor deed. But what he said and did regarding them were always the words and deeds of one who deserves to be recognized as a most pious man.
From these accounts, it's difficult to understand how Socrates could have been charged with impiety. But Plato's account offers a key to why the Athenians would make such a mistake. Socrates claimed that his trial derived from what he calls the first accusations, which, as we've seen, were used to slander him long before his prosecutors actually indicted him. Socrates characterized the first accusations early in his defense speech.
There is a Socrates, a wise man, a thinker about the things in the heavens, and who has inquired into the things under the earth, and who makes the weaker argument the stronger. People who hear such accusations think that those who investigate these things also do not believe in the gods.
Socrates claims that these accusations are completely false. They derive from a vicious distortion of his philosophical activities which amount to no less than a religious mission. Socrates explains how this distortion has occurred by telling the notorious story of the oracle to Chaerephon. In attempting to understand the oracle, Socrates had become convinced that the god had assigned him the mission of exposing the ignorance of his fellow Athenians. But this very mission had caused Socrates to be mistrusted and resented, even hated. Young men liked to imitate him, so people said he corrupted the youth. This slander is nothing but the invention of those who wish to hide their shame in being shown to be ignorant.
And whenever someone would ask those who promote the prejudice against me, by doing or teaching what does Socrates corrupt the youth, they have nothing to say, but do not know. And yet, lest they not seem confused, they say those things that are convenient against all philosophers, the things in the air and under the earth, and they do not believe in the gods, and they make the weaker argument the stronger. For I think they would not want to say the truth, that it is being made very clear that while pretending to know, they know nothing. Therefore, inasmuch as they are lovers of honor, and vehement, and many, and speak eagerly and persuasively about me, they have filled your ears for a long time with vehement slanders.
Socrates saw no need to critically investigate the religious beliefs of himself or others while he was philosophizing. Aristotle tells us, and we have every reason to believe him, that Socrates confined his philosophical attentions almost entirely to ethics. Socrates attended to theological issues only as they relate to ethical concerns. In fact, his general lack of interest in discussing religious matters is starkly evident in Plato's dialogue called Phaedrus. Here, Phaedrus expresses skepticism about a popular myth involving Boreas, the god of the north wind. Socrates responds with what many contemporary philosophers would find an astonishing lack of intellectual interest in religion.
And if someone who doesn't believe in these things would seek to explain each of them in accordance with probability, by using a bumpkinish sort of wisdom, he will need much leisure. But I have no leisure for these things at all. And the reason, O friend, is this: I cannot yet, as the Delphic inscription has it, know myself. So it seems laughable to me, when I do not know these things, to investigate the still unknown, and purposeless. So I do not pursue these things, but in accepting what is believed about them, as I said just now, I investigate not these things, but myself.
Ancient Greek religion was a jumble of myths. For the most part, Socrates unreflectively accepted them and intellectually ignored them. He even regarded the attempt to critically analyze these myths as a type of vanity, or what he called a bumpkinish sort of wisdom for which he had no leisure. This doesn't mean that he believed these myths to be literally true. It means only that he did not bother to consider how and in what sense such myths might be true. Nonetheless, Socrates held certain religious beliefs that did set him apart from his contemporaries. This was especially true of his beliefs about matters where religion and ethics are connected. Nowhere is this more evident than in Plato's Euthyphro. Here, as we've seen, Socrates questions a young man who intends to prosecute his own father, despite the protests of his relatives, who claim that the prosecution is impious. Euthyphro thinks he knows all there is to know about piety and impiety, so he is deaf to the arguments of his relatives. Euthyphro explains to Socrates that his prosecution follows the pattern established by Zeus himself, who bound and mutilated his own divine father for wrongs he had done. At this remark, Socrates breaks in, expressing great doubts that the gods, whom he regards as infinitely wise, could really be guilty of ugly and evil actions. Indeed, he knows of nothing good that has come to humans that has not come from the gods. It is questionable whether the average Athenian believed, as Socrates did, that the gods could do no wrong. Yet Socrates grounded his belief in some of the common Greek myths about the gods, and the problem is that the myths are inconsistent. For example, they often claim that Zeus hates all lies. Then they go on to tell about some deceit for which Zeus is directly responsible. Insofar as Socrates does consider theological reform, it is a consistent and moralizing picture of the divine, a picture that was found only incompletely within the Greek myths of his day. Another example of Socrates' ethical posture toward Greek religion can be seen in his attitude towards the soul and the afterlife. In Socrates' time, stories of the afterlife were filled with inconsistencies. In some stories, the dead were said to uniformly suffer in a dull, grey, never-ending existence. The dead were said to be shades or ghosts, forever filled with longing for the mortal lives they have lost. In other stories of Greek myth, divine judges reward the good and punish the bad, so that the dead are said to achieve a balance of justice that is not always available to the living. Some Athenians suspected that there was no afterlife. Others preferred the view that souls would be reincarnated, either as humans or as other life forms. Perhaps it was because of these inconsistent accounts of the afterlife that Socrates' contemporaries generally feared death. They regarded it as perhaps the worst evil that could happen to them. Socrates mocks such an attitude in Plato's Apology.
The fear of death is nothing but the belief that one is wise when one is not. For it is to believe one knows what one does not know. No one knows whether death happens to be the greatest of all goods for a person. But people fear it, as if they knew it were the greatest of evils. And is this not the most disgraceful sort of ignorance? That of thinking that one knows what one does not know? In this way, I am perhaps different from most people. And if I am wiser in anything, it is this, that not having adequate knowledge about what is in Hades, I do not think I know.
Socrates obviously recognizes that he lacks knowledge about death and the afterlife, but he has reasons not to fear them. His moralized view of the gods is that they will do no evil to good people, either in life or in death. Accordingly, Socrates had an almost cheerful attitude towards his own execution. In Plato's Crito and Gorgias, Socrates makes it clear that he is inclined to accept the stories in which the dead go to Hades, which is a place for judgment. Such stories make it all the more urgent to live the best, most virtuous life possible. Wealth, fame, good looks, or anything else cannot rival the importance of morality in keeping your soul in the best possible condition. Perhaps the most puzzling of Socrates' religious beliefs is his trust in divination as a source of important information. He seems to unwaveringly accept the proclamations of the oracle at Delphi. The god, he says, could never lie. He seems to accept divination in many forms, claiming that the authority of the gods has been made evident to him and others through dreams, oracles, and other tokens of divine power. Socrates is a rationalist, but only to a point. Xenophon summarizes Socrates' view of the relationship between reason and revelation in this way.
What the gods give to us to do through learning, we must learn. What is hidden from mortals, we should try to find out from the god by divination.
Perhaps the most unusual of Socrates' beliefs about divination involved his conviction that he had a private sign or voice. His daimonion, a divine something, as he calls it, warned him to avoid errors that he otherwise would have made. Occasionally the warnings seem quite trivial, but when Socrates considers why the daimonion opposes him, he usually finds that something significant is at stake, something that Socrates had not noticed until the voice signaled an alert. In some cases, the divine sign seems to have profoundly influenced Socrates' life. Perhaps the most significant example was the opposition that Socrates perceived from his daimonion when he considered a political career. In democratic Athens, political activity was generally expected from an intelligent and ethically concerned citizen. Socrates explained the significance of the opposition from his daimonion in a famous passage in Plato's Apology.
It might seem strange that I go about and mind other people's business, giving advice in private, but don't come before the assembly and advise the state. The reason for this is that something divine comes to me. I have had this since childhood. It is a kind of voice that comes to me. And when it comes, it always holds me back from what I would have done, but never urges me to do anything. This is what opposes my taking up political activity.
Socrates goes on to argue that the daimonion's opposition is a very good thing. He would not have lived as long, nor would he have had as much time to oppose wrongs if he had undertaken his mission in political forums. He surely would have been put to death much earlier by political enemies. It seems clear that Socrates was charged with inventing new gods because he claimed to have a private divinatory sign. But he showed at his trial that his religious belief in his daimonion was entirely earnest. Because of his religious sincerity, he easily countered the prosecution's attempt to portray him as a scientific atheist. The story of Socrates is a peculiar one. On the one hand, he claimed that he did not attend to theological speculations. On the other hand, he worked out a thoroughly moral conception of the gods as omniscient and omnibenevolent, that is, all-knowing and all-kind. Another irony is that Socrates scorned the fear of death, but had no great confidence in his own beliefs about the afterlife. Whatever death holds, Socrates believed it will not be bad for those who have carefully made their souls as good as possible. Socrates characterized himself as a man who has lived the examined life, upholding the life of reason as the best possible life for a human being. And yet he also accepted that oracles, dreams, and signs from the gods are abundant and reliable. He even claimed to have his own personal divine monitor. The same Socrates who gives us the dialectical method of reasoning, a method we still use to test and clarify our philosophical views, is powerfully revealed through his famous paradoxes. Socrates also is forever veiled or hidden to us within those same paradoxes. We may never be in a position to explain why this is so. As Socrates says, we may never know how these things are. But at least we can come to recognize that some views are better than others, and we can strive to identify and live the morally virtuous life that was so all-important to Socrates. It is not surprising that after Socrates was executed, a number of his friends and followers tried to continue his work. Plato and Xenophon are the best-known examples. There were many others as well. Their influence on the development of Western philosophy is well documented, though most of their Socratic writings have been lost. What is surprising is the rich diversity of views that claim to draw directly out of Socrates' philosophy. Antisthenes, an Athenian and friend of Socrates, founded a school in Athens that taught that moral virtue is all one needs to be happy. He said the desire for anything else is irrational. Through Antisthenes and the like-minded Diogenes, one can trace the origin of ancient cynicism to Socrates. Aristippus of Cyrene, another acquaintance of Socrates, founded the so-called Cyrenaic school, which affirmed that the good life is the life of simple pleasure and the absence of pain. There are reasons to believe that Aristippus had an important influence on Epicurus. And if this is so, then Epicureanism also had its roots in Socratic philosophy. Aristotle himself must also be mentioned in this connection. He didn't know Socrates, but he did know a great deal about Socrates through his teacher, Plato. Socrates unmistakably influenced Aristotle, though Aristotle always added important qualifications to each of the Socratic positions he embraced. In general, Aristotle's solutions to ethical problems are often much closer to those of Socrates than to those of his own teacher, Plato. Finally, the founder of the Stoic school, Zeno of Citium, also did not personally know Socrates, but he must have known a great deal about him. When Zeno began writing and teaching in Athens at the end of the 4th century BC, the various doctrines of Socrates already were being frequently discussed and debated. Like Aristotle, Zeno was informed by a great many sources, but he embraced the unmistakably Socratic convictions that all human beings can think for themselves and that moral virtue is centrally important to happiness. Once Christianity had taken root in Europe, the debate about Socrates' importance shifted away from what he actually believed to whether his pagan views were compatible with the new religion. Justin the Martyr is typical of those who found Socrates to be an admirable figure. Writing to the Roman Senate in the 2nd century, Justin compared Socrates to the Christians, who were then being persecuted for resisting the official state religion.
There were those who were born before Christ assumed human form, who were also dragged into law courts as irreligious and meddling persons, when they tried, in human narrowness, to think out and prove things by reason. Socrates, the most ardent of all in this regard, was accused of the very crimes that are imputed to us Christians. They claimed that he introduced new divinities and did not believe in the official gods of the city.
But an early Christian named Tertullian frowned on Socrates, accusing him of being influenced by satanic forces.
All the wisdom of Socrates proceeded from the affection of an assumed composure, rather than the firm conviction of an ascertained truth. For by whom has truth ever been discovered without God? By whom has God ever been found without Christ? By whom has Christ ever been explored without the Holy Spirit? By whom has the Holy Spirit ever been attained without the mysterious gift of faith? Socrates, as none can doubt, was actuated by a different spirit. For they say that a demon clung to him from his boyhood, the very worst teacher certainly, notwithstanding the high place assigned to it by poets and philosophers, even next to, nay, along with the gods themselves. The teachings of the power of Christ had not yet been given, that power which alone can confute this most pernicious influence of evil that has nothing good in it, but is rather the author of all error and the seducer from all truth.
As Western civilization passed into the so-called Dark Ages, the little that was known about Socrates was transmitted by a few Roman writers, such as Cicero, who referred to him in passing. Even during the Middle Ages, a time when most of Plato's writings were being rediscovered in Western Europe, Socrates joined all the other ancient philosophers standing in the giant shadow cast by Aristotle. It was Aristotle's views that would dominate the European centers of learning until the modern age began. During the Renaissance, Socrates was once again held up as a model to be emulated. The French essayist René Montaigne wrote admiringly of Socrates' simple approach to pursuing the truth.
Socrates makes his soul move with a natural and ordinary motion. A peasant says this, a woman says that. He talks only of horsemen, carpenters, cobblers, and masons. There are inductions and comparisons of the most common and familiar actions of men. Everyone understands him. Beneath so vile an exterior, we would never have picked out the nobility and splendor of his admirable ideas. We, who estimate as low and base all that does not elevate science, and who recognize riches only in display and pomp.
Socrates has generally been cited with approval by philosophers since the Renaissance, even by philosophers who oppose one another. Both sides in a philosophical dispute have sometimes quoted or cited Socrates in support of fundamentally different views. For instance, the Danish existentialist philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who had unshakable faith in the afterlife, praised Socrates for his fearlessness in the face of death.
To be sure, his was a tragic fate. And yet, the death of Socrates is not essentially tragic, since death had no reality for Socrates, and he faced it readily.
On the other hand, the great 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who's widely known for his pronouncement that God is dead, praised Socrates for his willingness to die rather than abandon his conviction.
That he was sentenced to death, not exile, Socrates himself seems to have brought about with perfect awareness, and without any natural awe of death. He went to his death with the calm with which, according to Plato, he leaves the symposium at dawn, the last of the revelers, to begin a new day.
Today, Socrates continues to be the very symbol of intellectual integrity. His views about how to live also continue to be influential. Some ethicists have become dissatisfied with modern, rule-oriented approaches to ethics that sometimes seem to produce unacceptable results. Many ethicists have returned to a view of right action that focuses on good character, or what Socrates called virtue. According to this modern theory of virtue, right actions flow from such qualities as courage, benevolence, and justice. And in asking what these qualities are, or how they are to be acquired, philosophers once again are engaging in the very approach to philosophy that Socrates used when he interrogated people who thought they were wise, some 2,400 years ago.